For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Woodley. Head of the Brenthurst Foundation, Greg Mills, joins me today to discuss his co-authored book, A Great Perhaps, Colombia, Conflict and Convergence. After decades of internal conflict, the situation in Colombia is showing signs of improvement. What has been the basis of the ongoing conflict in the country, and what have been the key drivers of the recent improvement?
Well, the basis of the conflict is, of course, political, going back to the 1960s, and this was originally a Marxist insurgency driven by very high levels of inequality in Colombian society traditionally, and that has gone through several iterations. And of course, come the end of the Cold War, the various guerrilla movements had to make a plan as to where they were going to get funded from, and they went over into the drug trade as a principal source of funding. So the insurgency, the sort of political insurgency, and criminality more or less morphed into one, and that has really continued up until the 2000s, where it strengthened the insurgency greatly, to the point that the Colombian government really had lost control over the majority of the country. Already it's a very strange country in the sense that the majority of the population lives in cities. 3/4 of the people live in cities, and they live along a very narrowly defined sort of central mountain range for the most part, and there are large chunks of the country which remain unpopulated or underpopulated and really ungoverned. And that lack of governance, these ungoverned spaces, was worsened by the levels of insurgency, to the point that by the Colombian government's own admission by the early 2000s, although they'd attempted various peace deals, it was essentially a failed state. And the remarkable thing about Colombia, and this has got such positive lessons for some African countries in similar situations, is that they have turned it around in less than a generation. They now govern the vast majority of the country. There's about 1,100 municipalities in Colombia. Previously, I say more than half of them, the government didn't have control over. Today, 90% of them they have control over. So it's not just top-down governance; it's governance all the way up the sort of levels from municipalities all the way to central government, and they've been able to do this in just 15 years.
The book is based on fieldwork in Colombia's regions. How did you and your 3 co-authors approach the writing of this important book?
This is a long-term process of engagement with the Colombian government. It goes back to 2006. I spent quite a lot of time that year as the commander's advisor in Afghanistan, and Colombia seemed to me, and that was a fairly difficult experience, as you would imagine, and Colombia seemed to me to offer a much more positive way of dealing with an insurgency, of dealing with issues of governance, and particularly about local ownership of the problem, and thus ownership of the solution. And so we started first going to Colombia at the end of 2006. Subsequently, we've taken quite a large number of Africans, policymakers, opinion formers, different African delegations from different countries to Colombia to learn about different things. So about the economy, about the economic transition, about the way in which they've combated criminality, because this was a country only 20 years ago known as the land of Pablo Escobar. And how they dealt with criminality, how they separated the insurgent from drugs. These are all very important lessons for countries facing similar circumstances. So for a number of years we took these delegations, and in 2014 and 2015 we took a number of African delegations, including one headed by President Obasanjo to Colombia, and out of that process came the idea to write up this book. So it wasn't just a short burn process. This has been in the making for some time, but we only started writing the book in the middle of 2015, and it was completed at the end of last year. And our first engagement was to go back to Nigeria at President Buhari's invitation and speak to various members of the Nigerian government about the Colombian experience. Because, as I say, it's such a powerful one because it's in recent memory, it's within a generation, it's largely been done by the locals, using external assistance, but been managed by the locals, and it's a whole-of-government approach. It's not just about dealing with an insurgency through military means alone. It's about dealing with an insurgency through improving economic opportunities, through reducing inequality, through extending governance, to making Colombia a place for all Colombians and building a single nation. And those are, I think, very powerful lessons for some, not all, but for some African countries facing similar situations, particularly those such as Nigeria with the Boko Haram insurgency, and indeed Kenya or Uganda or Somalia with Al-Shabaab.
Why did you and your co-authors decide to compile a book specifically on Colombia's conflict and transformation?
I think Colombia has very powerful lessons for countries facing similar situations. It is not an example of an expeditionary process of dealing with an insurgency or dealing with criminality. And by that I mean it's not about America or a European country or somebody else coming from somewhere else to solve your problems for you. This is about a government identifying what its problems were, and then through very good leadership, as I've said at every level, but particularly very good political leadership at the top, addressing the problems. And I think those have very powerful lessons for African countries, have very powerful lessons for countries further afield as well. And it just shows what is possible in a short space of time without somebody else solving your problems or attempting to solve your problems for you. One of the, I think, unique features about Colombia has been the energy levels of the heads of state involved and the degree of continuity between the various heads of state. So this process started under President Pastrana, who attempted a peace process in the late 1990s. That failed. He then started Plan Colombia, which is essentially American assistance for the Colombians. That was then picked up by President Álvaro Uribe in 2002. He served 2 terms of 4 years, total of 8 years, until 2010. He was succeeded in turn by Juan Manuel Santos, the current president. And there's been this incredible continuity and very high energy levels on the part of leadership to make sure that they extend governance down to the very reaches, down to the very furthest extremes of Colombia. And I think that's a very powerful lesson. I've been on some of these community councils where the president would visit a different municipality of the 1,100 municipalities every weekend, sometimes 2 a weekend. He would take ministers with him. He would understand what the problems were in those areas, and he would report back. And now that's something I think everyone in Africa can learn from, this degree of connectedness between leadership and the people who are really facing at the coalface of these problems.
How can the progress made in Colombia be used as an example to other countries dealing with conflict?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to recognize it's not just a military problem. There's always a tendency to say, oh, you know, this can be solved by military means alone. There's a whole of government approach required: governance, the economy, social aspects, rebuilding areas of economic activity in the sort of geographic reaches which are most badly affected by the conflict. This is all part and parcel of addressing the core reasons for conflict and some of the consequences of conflict. And perhaps very importantly in all of that is to try and separate out the insurgent and criminality, and particularly in the case of Colombia, the drug trade, which has obviously had a disproportionate effect on what's happened there. I think those are very powerful lessons. And I think perhaps the most powerful lesson, and I think the most sort of important and sanguine lesson for Africa is that you can do this in a relatively short space of time. Generally, there's a rule out there which is that the period of recovery in conflict is at least as long as the period of decline. And the Colombians have done it a little bit quicker than that. And they've done it a little bit quicker than that through this incredible focus across government, which has required, I think, such an active leadership. The message is simple. You've got to own the problem, to own the solution, and to make it an effective one. And that, I think, can be learned by anybody, whether in fact they're in conflict or not in conflict.
Are there any specific lessons for African countries caught up in internal strife?
I think they're very interesting lessons, particularly on some of the, not just the strategic areas, but some of the tactical areas. So, for example, the Colombians have not succumbed to the temptation of equipping themselves with the latest and best of military equipment. They have gone out and worked out exactly what they required, and sometimes it's very low technology, and they have used that to best effect for their purposes. They've also built very good intelligence structures within and outside of the country, and that's helped them greatly in this endeavor. They have been able to really increase the effectiveness of the military, increase the effectiveness of the police, which falls under the military in Colombia. I mean, we were in Medellin. Of course, Medellin, 20 years ago was kind of seen as a battleground. Now it's seen as one of the kind of, the most up-and-coming cities around the world. It's seen as an extremely dynamic place. It has gondolas flying overhead, linking otherwise disconnected parts of the city together. And I think virtually everybody, and I say virtually everybody, it probably was everybody, in the room where we were, and there were a large number of policemen, this one briefing that we had, everybody had a university degree. And as they told us 20 years ago, virtually nobody would have had a university degree. The transition has been phenomenal. The improvements in educational standards, the improvements in the way in which they've recruited the types of talents that they need in government. All of this, I think, has very important lessons for African and indeed other countries. But I say the most important lesson of all is that even though they were once seen as a failed state, it was the ultimate metaphor for criminality. As they talked about Cartagena, it was blanco y negro, a line of white cocaine and a stiff espresso coffee. That image is not in sync with the modern Colombia. This is a highly sophisticated economy. It's a highly sophisticated political environment. And very interestingly, and here's a very distinct parallel for South Africa. It's a country with roughly the same number of people as South Africa. It is a country with a very similar length of coastline and also two oceans bordering on it. It has a difficult topography. We also have a difficult topography. We are virtually side by side in terms of conditions of inequality. We rank number 9th and 10th in terms of murders per 100,000 people in the world. In fact, they're better than we are, and they have improved dramatically from where they were in the 1990s in that context. There are a great number of social and economic parallels. We're very similar in terms of per capita income. And very interestingly, the largest investor in Colombia to date is SAB Miller. And it's one of their most profitable markets. Other South African-based mining companies are also very big investors there and have been very successful there. And I think it's because many African entrepreneurs and African people who've acquired their skills in Africa and vice versa are able to see very similar commonalities in each of those two countries and ways of operating and ways of problem solving. And I think it speaks volumes about the talents in both Colombia and in South Africa.
The book is titled A Great Perhaps, Colombia, Conflict and Convergence. Why this title?
Well, it's a quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel laureate. And I thought I was the one who stumbled on it while reading, as one does when one travels in such places, one of his novels. And I thought it summarized all the hope and promise and transition that Colombia has undertaken in this short space of time. To go from the land synonymous with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin and Cali cartels to a country really which is poised on real greatness in terms of growth and change and dynamism, and of course the peace talks that are happening underway, which are underway at the moment in Havana, which will be, in a sense, the ultimate conclusion to this process. And often the Colombians look to South Africa for many of these lessons too. It's poised to be a great success, and so it is still, however, a great perhaps. Will they go backwards? Will they keep going forwards? These are big questions. And it's about ending conflict, and it's about the convergence of society, about reducing inequalities, about bringing together common standards of governance, about extending infrastructure to the 75% of the country that was virtually devoid of infrastructure, basic infrastructure, roads, telecommunications and the like. That's their challenge. It's about convergence of the society, and hence the title.
What was the biggest challenge in writing this book?
Well, the biggest challenge, of course, in writing a book with 3 other people is that you've got to stick to deadlines and not have too much in the way of ego, because otherwise you're going to get, you're going to take umbrage every time you're beaten up by your fellow co-authors. And I think we were all at a stage of our careers which we don't really mind people saying nasty things about us. And of course, it was one Australian, one Brit, one American, one South African. And I'm very pleased to say it was, the South Africans were the ones who led with it, and the foundation was the one who came up with this idea in the beginning. And I think that's testament to some of the ingenuity that we have in South Africa. And this process, as you've seen from the back of the book, was very much endorsed by a range of African leadership. And so it's I think in some ways a little bit of a memorial to some African foresight, but with very much a lot of support given by the Colombians, by civil society and by government, providing access process. And I think perhaps logistically that was the greatest challenge. It's not the easiest country in the world to get to, particularly for someone from South Africa. You have to always go at least via one place, sometimes two places to get there. It's literally on the other side of the world. This involved a lot of time in the field, a lot of the time in the places that I've been describing to you, where there's no governance or very limited levels of governance, not just in the capital cities. And the foundation prides itself on always getting out there to the more difficult spots, the coastal towns of Buenaventura or Tumaco, for example, into the Amazonian areas, understanding what the real problems are on the ground, speaking to people in conflict, speaking to ex-combatants. We spent a lot of time interviewing ex-FARC and ELN guerrillas in safe houses in Cali. And we took President Boyoya of Burundi to go and meet these folk who'd come in from the guerrilla movements and try to understand what they were fighting for and why they had come in and why at this particular juncture. And that helped to provide a picture for us from the inside, more than if we'd just written it from behind our computer terminals in our respective capitals. So the logistics of writing a book and doing the field work involved considerable time, but we like to think it was worth it.
What impact do you hope this book will ultimately have?
It's about sharing an experience. We don't consider it to be a template. We don't even suggest that there are lessons to be learned, really. It's a particular experience. It is within a unique context. There are similarities that I've already pointed out, South Africa and others, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab and so on. But I would hope that African thinkers, in particular, because that's what the foundation is concerned with, will pick up the book and read it and say, okay, there's some interesting stuff here that we can take and digest and maybe in our own way, in our own context, apply some of these examples. And we've taken, as I said, people from Nigeria and from Burundi and from Kenya and other places there, and they've been almightily impressed by what they've seen in Colombia. And the book is a way of kind of codifying that, putting it down on paper, that we can reach an even wider audience. We spoke to a group a couple of months ago in Jaji in the north of Nigeria at the Staff College, about 400 senior military students from all over the world at the Staff College, and the feedback was tremendous, because it's not about what the Americans did in Afghanistan or someone did in Malaya or somebody else did in somebody else's country. It's about what people did for themselves.